7 years have passed, yet the whispers have never stopped. Across podcasts, Facebook groups, YouTube threads, and late-night Reddit debates, one name still stirs the same chill it did the week the story broke: Chris Watts. A husband. A father. A man who smiled for family photos while planning the unthinkable. The world has seen hundreds of domestic crime cases, but few have burrowed so deeply into the collective mind as this one. And maybe that's because, even after a confession, a conviction, and a lifetime sentence, people still feel something doesn't add up. Every few months, a new petition appears online: reopen the Chris Watts case. Each time, thousands of signatures flood in, ordinary people demanding answers from a story they can't seem to let go. But why? Why does a closed case still pull at so many hearts and minds? To understand that obsession, we have to go back to the beginning, to a summer morning in Frederick, Colorado, when the facade of a perfect suburban life cracked open to reveal the darkness beneath. It was August 13, 2018. Shanann Watts, 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant, had just returned from a business trip. She texted her husband after midnight. No response. By sunrise, she had vanished. Her friend Nicole Atkinson, alarmed when Shanann missed an OB appointment and stopped replying, called the police. Officers arrived at the Watts house that afternoon. They found her car in the garage, purse and phone still inside. Her wedding ring lay on the nightstand. On camera, Chris Watts appeared distraught. He pleaded for his family's safe return. "Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, come back. The house isn't the same without you." That clip aired on every major network. Viewers saw a grieving husband, but something about him felt off. His eyes were dry. His tone was too measured. Within 24 hours, detectives began to sense that his calm wasn't grief, it was performance. Inside the interrogation room, he folded and unfolded his hands, tracing invisible lines on the table. He told them they'd argued. He said she'd taken the kids to a friend's house. But investigators had already checked every friend, every neighbor's camera, every GPS ping. Nothing matched his story. A neighbor's surveillance footage finally cracked the image: Chris Watts backing his truck into the driveway at 5:17 a.m., loading something heavy before driving away. When officers replayed the video in front of him, his mask slipped for just a second, a subtle shake of the head, a tightening of his jaw. That single reaction became one of the most analyzed micro-expressions in true crime history. Days later, the truth emerged in fragments. He had strangled Shanann in their bedroom. He had smothered their daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Then he buried Shanann in a shallow grave at an oil site where he worked, placing his daughters' bodies in separate oil tanks. The nation froze. News anchors struggled to find words. How could a man who seemed so ordinary, smiling family photos, barbecues, neighborhood playdates, commit such horror? And perhaps more disturbing, why? In the following weeks, every headline, every documentary, every tweet sought an answer. Prosecutors called it an act of selfishness, driven by an affair and a desire for freedom. Psychologists described a textbook case of narcissistic collapse, when a man's carefully curated image can't survive the pressure of real life. But the public wasn't satisfied. Because in the age of digital footprints, everyone could watch the case unfold in real time. Bodycam footage. Interrogation videos. Facebook lives from Shanann's page, smiling, selling health products, showing love for her husband. People didn't just hear about the tragedy, they lived it, hour by hour, comment by comment. And once you've lived inside a case like that, closure becomes impossible. By November 2018, Chris Watts accepted a plea deal, 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was moved out of Colorado for his own safety, ultimately ending up in a Wisconsin prison. Officially, that should have been the end. But it wasn't. Months later, letters started leaking from behind the walls of Dodge Correctional Institution. He claimed he'd found God. He said he'd been forgiven. He said he was a new man. And with each new statement, the internet reignited. Because for the families of victims, forgiveness is sacred. But when the killer declares it for himself, it sounds like manipulation. Those letters didn't close the wound, they tore it open again. As years passed, the conversation shifted. Some focused on the psychological: was Chris what's truly remorseful, or simply rewriting his story from the safety of his cell? Others went further, convinced that the full truth never surfaced. They dissected phone records, GPS data, deleted messages. They drew timelines, red-circled inconsistencies, and wondered if he'd had help. Law enforcement has repeatedly said there's no evidence anyone else was involved. Yet online, speculation became its own kind of evidence, fed by emotion, not proof. That's how the case transformed from tragedy to obsession. Not because of new clues, but because of unfinished emotion. People saw their own fears in it, the betrayal of trust, the danger behind an ordinary smile, the illusion of safety inside four walls. The official case file may be sealed, but the conversation lives on. Every petition that surfaces online isn't really about reopening the investigation, it's about reopening the wound society never healed. We watch, we analyze, we re-upload every second of interrogation footage, trying to decode something humanity still can't explain. How love can turn into annihilation. In true crime, most stories fade with time. But this one keeps circling back, each retelling revealing less about the man himself and more about us. The watchers, the analyzers, the citizens who need answers even when there are none left to find. And so, the case remains officially closed, yet socially alive. A paradox of our digital age: justice delivered, closure denied. Because somewhere between his prison letters and the petitions demanding a retrial lies the heartbeat of modern curiosity, a need to believe there's still more to uncover. Whether that's truth or obsession, only time will tell. But on that quiet August night in 2018, long before the headlines, before the petitions, before the endless documentaries, something inside Chris Watts finally broke. And that fracture would send shockwaves through every living room in America. The summer heat had begun to fade over Frederick, Colorado. In the Watts household, everything looked normal, the kind of calm that photographs can capture but life can't sustain. Neighbors saw smiles. Online, Shanann posted affection. But behind the walls, something in the marriage had already fractured beyond repair. It began quietly. Chris had grown distant. His messages turned shorter, his eyes colder. Shanann, who once called him her rock, started noticing gaps in his affection. Friends would later testify that she felt the change but couldn't name it. She thought it was work stress, fatigue, anything but betrayal. In reality, Chris was living a double life. He'd started an affair with a coworker from Anadarko Petroleum. While Shanann traveled for business, he was texting another woman, imagining a new beginning built on lies. That fantasy hardened into motive. On August 11th and 12th, Shanann was away on a business trip in Arizona. Her friends said she was exhausted, pregnant, juggling kids, and sensing that something at home was slipping out of her control. She confided in them, "He doesn't touch me anymore. I feel like I'm losing him." Those words would later echo like prophecy. She landed back in Colorado at 1:48 a.m. on August 13th. Security cameras at her friend Nicole Atkinson's house captured her stepping out of the car, suitcase in hand, unaware she was walking into the last night of her life. Upstairs, Chris was awake. He'd already decided what to do. Investigators pieced together the next few hours from phone records, forensic data, and his own confession. They believe Shanann confronted him about the affair, demanded honesty. She reminded him she was carrying his unborn son, Nico. He told her he didn't love her anymore. He said he wanted to start over. The argument escalated. Then, in a burst of rage and finality, he strangled her. What happened next defies comprehension. Their daughters, Bella and Celeste, woke up. They saw their mother lifeless. He told them she was sick. He wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet, placed it in the back of his work truck, and told the girls they were going for a drive. At 5:17 a.m. Neighbor Nate Trinestica's security camera captured him backing his truck into the driveway, the moment investigators would later call the point of no return. He loaded the sheet-wrapped form, then carried the children, still alive, into the cab. He drove 45 miles to the remote oil field where he worked. There, beneath the wide Colorado sky, he finished what he had started. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave, then placed each daughter in separate oil tanks. He later said he did it because he didn't want anyone to find them. A statement so detached it chilled even seasoned detectives. By the time he drove home, the sun had risen. He texted Shanann's phone, pretending to look for her. He called the daycare to ask if the girls were dropped off. He played the part of the confused husband with precision. When Nicole Atkinson arrived that afternoon, suspicion began to build. She found Shanann's purse, phone, and wedding ring still in the house, signs no woman leaving voluntarily would forget. Police arrived minutes later. Bodycam footage shows Chris pacing, arms crossed, voice flat. Officers noted the strange lack of panic. He granted them permission to search, yet his answers felt rehearsed. When a neighbor invited the officer next door to review security footage, Chris stood behind them. On the screen, his truck appeared at dawn, something he hadn't mentioned. The neighbor later said, "He's not acting right." That short sentence shifted the entire investigation. That night, detectives invited him to the station. What followed became one of the most studied interrogations in modern true crime. He insisted he was innocent. He passed a lie detector test request, then failed it miserably. Confronted, he tried to redirect blame, claiming Shanann had harmed the children and he'd reacted. But within hours, his story collapsed. The truth came out piece by piece, filtered through pauses and tears that didn't reach his eyes. Investigators later said his calm confession was more disturbing than the crime itself. By the next morning, the search that had gripped the nation turned into a recovery mission. Crews descended on the oil site. When they found the bodies, even hardened officers broke down. One described it as, "the day innocence died twice." The discovery shattered Frederick's small-town peace. Neighbors who'd barbecued with the Watts family couldn't comprehend that the smiling man on local news had done this. For them, the story wasn't just about murder, it was about betrayal of everything they believed safe and familiar. As the sun set that evening, the headlines began. Colorado father confesses. Bodies found at oil site. Why did he do it? And across living rooms, millions stared at their screens in disbelief. The story was too monstrous to process, yet too ordinary to dismiss. It could have been anyone's street, anyone's family photo. When he appeared in court days later, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, the silence was deafening. He barely looked up as charges were read. 5 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of pregnancy, and tampering with a body. Each word carved another wound into public trust. But for investigators, something still didn't sit right. His confessions shifted depending on who was asking. He left gaps, minutes unaccounted for, details altered. When agents pressed, he shut down. He had told the truth once, but not the whole truth. Those inconsistencies would later fuel every theory, every online breakdown, every petition demanding the case be reopened. Because in stories like this, uncertainty breeds obsession. And what began as one man's crime soon became everyone's question. When the confession came, it wasn't a dramatic outburst or a sudden breakdown. It was quiet, too quiet. Inside a small, windowless room at the Frederick Police Department, Chris Watts leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll tell you the truth, but you're not going to like it." That was how one of the most chilling confessions in recent American history began. At first, his story twisted itself into knots. He said Shanann had killed the girls, that he'd only reacted. He painted himself as the shocked husband, the man who'd lost control in a moment of rage. But detectives had been here before. They'd seen the signs. The calm tone, the emotional distance, the subtle way he shifted blame away from himself. They knew that when a killer blames the victim, the truth is close, but inverted. The investigators stayed patient. They showed him photos of his family. They read him Shanann's last text messages. They reminded him of the daughters who used to wait by the window when he came home. They weren't just asking for a confession, they were peeling away the layers of denial one lie at a time. Then came the pause, that long, suffocating silence on the recording that would later haunt anyone who watched it. Finally, his voice cracked just enough to sound human. "I did it. It was me." He confessed, but not fully. Even in admitting guilt, Chris Watts edited reality. He left out details, reshaped events, softened the brutality. He described it like an out-of-body experience, as if he were watching himself from the outside. Detectives called it detachment. Psychologists call it selective truth. By dawn, the confession was complete enough for prosecutors to proceed. But behind the scenes, the inconsistencies were already stacking up. He told one version to police, another to his father, and yet another in letters from prison months later. Each one contradicted the other, not dramatically, but subtly enough to raise doubt. In one, he claimed Shanann never fought back. In another, he said she looked him in the eyes before she died. In still another, he claimed dark forces had overtaken him that night. The contradictions weren't just disturbing, they were revealing. Each revision seemed like an attempt to rewrite the story into something he could live with. Because when killers talk about their crimes, they aren't just recounting what happened, they're reconstructing a world where they aren't monsters. When the plea deal arrived, it shocked even seasoned followers of the case. He agreed to plead guilty to all charges, in exchange for life without parole, sparing him the death penalty. Shanann's family supported the deal. They said they didn't want to endure a trial, to hear every gruesome detail, to relive it for years. And so, in a courtroom filled with grief and silence, the deal was signed. That should have been closure. But closure never came. Because when a story like this ends too neatly, people start looking for what's missing. Reporters, true crime investigators, and internet sleuths began dissecting every timeline, every document, every camera angle. Why did his story keep changing? Why did he show so little remorse in court? Why did certain digital records, text messages, GPS pings, still feel incomplete? For the next year, the case lived a second life online. Podcasts replayed the interrogation tapes frame by frame. YouTubers uploaded psychological breakdowns. Reddit users built timelines so detailed they resembled police files. And then came the letters, dozens of them. Written to pen pals, journalists, and curious strangers, they were signed from his prison cell in Wisconsin. In those pages, the contradictions deepened. He wrote that he'd been forgiven by God. He wrote that he was a changed man. He claimed that he heard Shanann's voice in his dreams, that his daughters visit him in spirit. To some, it sounded like remorse. To others, it sounded like manipulation, a man still performing for an audience, even behind bars. One line from those letters captured the duality perfectly. "I didn't deserve their love, but I'll spend the rest of my life learning how to love again." The public was divided. Some said his words were a sign of faith, that maybe, after all, even monsters can change. Others saw them as emotional theater, a man who destroyed lives now using religion as a shield. Meanwhile, new contradictions kept emerging. In one interview, he claimed he'd never planned the murders. But in another, he admitted he'd been plotting for weeks. He told one visitor he saw evil shadows that night. Another time, he said he felt free. Every statement fed the online firestorm, each inconsistency another reason for the public to believe there was more to uncover. The irony was painful. The truth had been confessed, yet no one believed it. Not because the evidence was unclear, but because human beings can't accept senselessness without reason. We crave logic, motive, sequence. And this crime had none that satisfied the soul. So the case became two stories. The one written in the court documents, final, sealed, indisputable. And the one written in the minds of millions, open-ended, unsolved, emotionally unfinished. When Chris Watts entered prison, officials reported he spent his first nights in isolation. He wasn't allowed to mix with other inmates, his name alone carried too much danger. He reportedly spends most of his time reading the Bible, working menial tasks, and writing letters. Some inmates call him preacher. Others refuse to speak to him at all. But even in that controlled environment, his story kept leaking out. Every new statement, every scribbled note sent through the mail, became a headline. And each headline kept the question alive, the question that haunts every viewer who's watched the footage, read the transcripts, or stared into his cold, expressionless eyes. Can a man who destroys everything he loves ever truly tell the truth? In every infamous crime, there's always someone the public can't stop talking about. Someone who didn't commit the act but became part of the story's gravity, pulled into its orbit by proximity, speculation, and suspicion. In the Watts case, that person was Nicole Kessinger. She was a co-worker at Anadarko Petroleum, intelligent, independent, and by all accounts, unaware of the darkness hiding behind the man who courted her. When the affair came to light, the internet turned on her overnight. Her name became synonymous with blame, her face plastered across tabloids, her life dissected by millions of strangers searching for answers that weren't hers to give. Chris Watts met Nicole in early summer 2018. By then, his marriage was unraveling, at least in his mind. He began pursuing her quietly, telling her he was separated, that his marriage was ending. She later said she believed him. There were no visible signs of deceit, no reason to question his version of the truth. They talked about simple things, hiking, fitness, books. He told her she was a breath of fresh air. He began constructing a second identity around her, one without responsibility, one without guilt. But as his lies grew, so did the distance between fantasy and reality. In late July, Shanann took the girls to North Carolina to visit family. While she was away, Chris spent the summer acting single. He took Nicole to restaurants, went camping, and sent her love songs and workout selfies. She had no idea that, back home, his wife was posting family videos, hoping to keep their marriage alive. Investigators later confirmed that Nicole had no involvement in the crime itself. Her cooperation helped them piece together the final timeline. Her phone data and messages became key evidence in tracking Chris's movements and mindset in the days leading up to the murders. Yet none of that protected her from public judgment. As soon as her name surfaced, she was vilified. Online users accused her of everything, from manipulation to conspiracy. She received threats, lost her job, and eventually disappeared from public view. To this day, no one knows where she is. She changed her name, left Colorado, and vanished from social media entirely. The fascination with Nicole Kessinger wasn't just about her, it was about what she represented. In the public eye, she became a symbol, the other woman, the forbidden figure blamed for tempting a husband into ruin. But deeper than that, she embodied the public's desperate need to explain the unexplainable. If love could make a man kill, perhaps it wasn't really love, perhaps it was lust, obsession, manipulation. And if that's true, people thought, maybe it wasn't random. Maybe there was something or someone else behind it. This kind of projection isn't new. In every high-profile murder, society seeks a villain we can understand, someone human enough to hate. Because hating the killer alone doesn't satisfy the mind. It feels incomplete, like screaming into an echo. So we look for accomplices, influencers, shadows. The irony is that Nicole herself was never charged, never suspected officially. Her interviews with police showed a woman in disbelief. Horrified, scared, trying to reconcile the man she knew with the monster the world now saw. She cried during questioning, saying, "If I had known what he was capable of, I'd have never looked at him twice." It was the reaction of someone who'd been manipulated, not complicit. But by then, the internet had already decided. The media ecosystem thrived on that decision. Every video thumbnail, every article headline used her name, because controversy sells faster than truth. And so, Nicole Kessinger became immortalized as the villain in a story she didn't write. From a storytelling perspective, she was the perfect foil. Beautiful, mysterious, silent, unseen since 2018. Her silence became fuel for theories. Where did she go? Why hasn't she spoken publicly? Did she ever contact him again? Each unanswered question made her absence louder. But silence doesn't always mean guilt. Sometimes silence is survival. In Prison Letters, Chris Watts still writes about her indirectly. He refers to a temptation I should have walked away from. He blames dark influence. He says, it all started with lies. To some readers, it sounds like repentance. To others, it sounds like blame, shifting the moral weight away from himself. That blame became a new spark for the petitions to reopen the case. Online groups began calling for justice, not because new evidence had surfaced, but because they believed Nicole Kessinger had more to tell. They demanded further questioning, renewed investigation, psychological profiling. They flooded forums with claims that she was in hiding under witness protection. There is, however, no public record to support that. Every official statement says the same thing: she cooperated fully, she was not charged, and she disappeared voluntarily. Still, the idea that she knows more persists, not because it's proven, but because it keeps the story alive. In the digital age, truth and myth often share the same stage. One grows from evidence, the other grows from emotion. And sometimes, the emotional version wins. When the case was closed, Nicole Kessinger's chapter should have ended. But in the eyes of the internet, it became eternal. Every few months, her name trends again, pulled back into headlines whenever Chris's letters resurface. She remains the ghost of the story, unseen but unforgettable. Because even though Chris Watts sits behind bars, serving 5 life sentences, the obsession with her reminds us that people don't just want justice. They want meaning. And when meaning is missing, they create it, even if it costs someone else their peace. The world may have moved on, but Chris Watts never left the headlines, not because of any new evidence, but because of his own words. From behind the gray walls of a Wisconsin prison, he found a way to speak again, through letters. At first, they were quiet. A few handwritten pages sent to strangers who wrote to him out of curiosity or morbid fascination. But over time, those letters began to surface online, shared by true crime bloggers, podcast hosts, and tabloids desperate for the next headline. Each new page added fuel to a fire that refused to die. His handwriting was neat, almost childlike. His tone, calm, polite, disturbingly casual. He called himself forgiven. He claimed he was a new man. He told one pen pal, "I've been saved by God. He has washed me clean." For some readers, those words sounded like repentance. For others, they sounded like delusion, a killer trying to rewrite history from the safety of a cell. In one letter, Watts wrote about the night of the murders as if describing someone else's actions. "It felt like I was outside my body. Like something came over me, and I couldn't stop it." He used words like darkness, possession, temptation. He said he was drained, that his mind was clouded by sin and deceit. But nowhere in those pages did he mention accountability. No sentence began with, "I chose." No line admitted that he planned it. Instead, he spoke in riddles of spiritual warfare, as if evil itself were the culprit and he, merely the vessel. Psychologists who reviewed his writing said this kind of language isn't unusual for killers seeking control. Once stripped of freedom, they reclaim power through narrative. reframing themselves as both sinner and victim, rewriting the story so they can live with it. And Chris Watts, even in confinement, understood the power of story. From his cell at Dodge Correctional Institution, he began corresponding with several women. Some were fascinated by his crimes, others believed they could heal him. They sent him money, books, and letters filled with sympathy. It's a pattern seen in many high-profile inmates, a mix of fascination, misplaced empathy, and the human urge to fix the broken. In one exchange, a pen pal asked him, "Do you still think about them?" His reply was chilling in its simplicity. "Every day. I see them in my dreams. Sometimes they talk to me." He said he had visions of his daughters singing songs to him in heaven. He claimed they'd forgiven him, and that Shanann had, too. He even described waking up one night to the feeling of a hand on my shoulder, saying, "It was Shanann, letting me know she's at peace." But for Shanann's family, those words felt like another betrayal. Her mother, Sandra Rzusek, called the letters manipulative, another way for Chris to make himself the center of attention. "He's not finding God," she told reporters. "He's finding excuses." And yet, the letters continued. Sometimes handwritten, sometimes typed, often filled with Bible verses copied from devotionals. He quoted Psalms, Proverbs, and passages about forgiveness. He began referring to himself as a servant of God's mercy. To the public, these letters were a Rorschach test. People saw in them whatever confirmed their beliefs: redemption, evil, deception, or insanity. But no matter the interpretation, one thing was certain: the letters kept the case alive. Each new batch sparked fresh debates on social media. Can monsters change? Can faith absolve murder? Or is redemption without justice just another illusion? Prison officials confirmed that Watts spends most of his days in solitude. He works in the kitchen, cleans floors, reads scripture, and occasionally watches television. He avoids other inmates. Some despise him, others ignore him entirely. In prison hierarchy, family killers rank near the bottom, despised even by thieves and drug dealers. He's been attacked once, according to unverified reports, but largely lives in protective custody. His world is a 6-by-8-foot cell, a metal bed, a Bible, and the echo of a story that refuses to fade. Still, he writes. In one letter, he told a correspondent that the murders were part of God's plan to humble him. He said, "If this hadn't happened, I'd never have found salvation." That line sent shockwaves through online communities, not because it offered insight, but because it revealed how far removed from reality he still was. To say that tragedy was divine correction felt like a second crime, this time against the memory of his victims. And yet, for every person disgusted by his words, another was captivated. The letters became digital relics, downloaded, shared, analyzed like sacred texts of evil. Viewers paused on handwriting, underlined phrases, compared ink shades. Every tiny inconsistency became a clue, every omission a new theory. The fascination wasn't just about him anymore, it was about the afterlife of guilt. What does remorse look like when the world doesn't believe it? What happens when a man who killed his family claims he's been reborn? In one of his most quoted lines, Watts wrote, "I don't deserve peace, but God gives it anyway." That line, more than any confession, defined the paradox of Chris Watts. A man who wanted mercy without memory, forgiveness without facing himself. To this day, his letters continue to leak, posted on Reddit, read aloud on podcasts, analyzed on YouTube. Each new one reignites anger, empathy, and obsession in equal measure. But the deeper you read, the clearer it becomes. He isn't searching for forgiveness from the world. He's searching for a version of the story where he's no longer the villain. Behind those bars, he can't change the past, but he can shape the narrative. And as long as people keep reading, he'll never truly be forgotten. When the courtroom closed and the sentence was final, most expected the story to fade into memory. But online, the investigation was only beginning. The digital world had taken hold of the Watts case, and it wasn't letting go. Reddit, YouTube, TikTok, and podcasts turned into extensions of the interrogation room. Thousands of self-made detectives, ordinary people with extraordinary curiosity, began pulling at every thread, frame, and file. They called themselves truth seekers, and they treated the case like an unsolved riddle. On Reddit, timelines appeared. Users reconstructed minute-by-minute breakdowns of the night of the murders, cross-referencing phone logs, GPS data, and surveillance footage. Others created 3D house maps, trying to understand how everything happened in silence. Every movement, every pause, every blink from the interrogation tapes became evidence of hidden guilt or unrevealed accomplices. On YouTube, commentary channels uploaded analysis videos, slow-motion replays of his body language during interviews, comparisons of tone before and after confession. Titles read, "The Lie You Missed in Chris Watts' Interview, Hidden Cues That Reveal His True Motive." Millions watched. Millions commented. And from there, an entire subculture was born, one built on curiosity, anger, and the illusion that perhaps, with enough analysis, someone online might discover a truth the police had missed. But here's the uncomfortable truth, for many, it was never about evidence. It was about emotion. Because this case didn't just expose one man's darkness, it exposed how society processes evil in the age of screens. We live in a world where tragedy becomes content, and grief becomes community. People who had never met Shanann, Bella, or Celeste found themselves mourning them as if they were family. They built digital shrines, Facebook pages, TikTok edits, tribute videos, each one collecting views, comments, and tears. It was empathy turned algorithm. Every upload, every theory, every headline ensured the case remained alive. Not because justice demanded it, but because attention rewarded it. Psychologists call it participatory trauma. It's when collective empathy turns into collective investigation. The more we hurt, the more we search. The more we search, the more the algorithm feeds us what we crave, new theories, new doubts, new reasons to stay hooked. Soon, the line between fact and interpretation blurred. Creators began interviewing psychic mediums, claiming to have spoken with Shanann's spirit. Others claimed to have exclusive leaks from the prison. Most were false, but they spread faster than the corrections. In a sense, Chris Watts' story became a reflection of the internet itself, a place where truth and illusion coexist, feeding off each other in endless loops. And yet, behind all that noise, a deeper question began to rise. Why do we keep watching? Why do millions of people, years after the crime, still spend hours dissecting the life of a man who took everything from his family? The answer lies in what the Watts case represents, not just a murder, but the collapse of something sacred: family, trust, love. It's not the crime that people can't let go of. It's the idea that it could happen in any neighborhood, behind any perfect-looking front door. That terror is universal. So, when we scroll through clips of Shanann's smiling videos, or read transcripts of his emotionless interviews, we're not just studying him. We're testing our own understanding of evil. We're trying to convince ourselves we'd see it coming, that we'd recognize the warning signs. That someone like Chris Watts could never be someone we know. But the internet doesn't let mysteries rest. Even when law enforcement declared the case closed, digital detectives refused to stop. They revisited satellite images of the oil site, claiming to see shadows that proved different timelines. They analyzed doorbell footage frame by frame, debating whether figures seen were real or reflections. They found patterns where none existed, because silence, in such a case, feels unbearable. And so, speculation became therapy. Each theory is another way to make sense of senselessness. Each debate is a ritual of control in a world where violence feels random and undeserved. To their credit, many investigators, retired and amateur alike, kept the conversation respectful, focused on truth and prevention. They discussed warning signs of domestic violence, narcissistic traits, and emotional manipulation. They used the Watts story to educate, to protect, to warn. But others took a darker turn, harassing the victim's family, creating conspiracy channels, accusing innocent people of involvement. It was an obsession masquerading as justice. What began as collective empathy became digital addiction. True crime had turned into a feedback loop: outrage, curiosity, conclusion, and back again. In the midst of it all, Chris Watts stayed silent, letting the world build narratives around him. He never publicly corrected a theory or denied a rumor. Perhaps he knew he no longer needed to. Because every time his name trended, every time his face reappeared in a thumbnail, the world unknowingly fed the one thing he'd always craved: attention. But what happens when attention replaces truth? When the story stops being about victims and starts being about theories? In that way, the Watts case became a mirror. A reflection of us, the audience, the consumers of tragedy, the ones who demand justice but click for drama. We may call it research. We may call it awareness. But deep down, what keeps this story alive is not the evidence, it's the doubt. Doubt has no expiration date. It keeps us watching. It keeps us wondering. And in the age of the internet, doubt is immortal. When a case is closed, most people move on. They accept the verdict, trust the system, and try to let the story fade. But with the Watts case, that never happened. Even after his guilty plea, after the sentencing, after every document was made public, people refused to let it rest. They believed there were missing pieces, gaps too wide, contradictions too sharp. And so, a new movement began. Not in courtrooms or law offices, but online, where ordinary citizens gathered under one unifying banner: reopen the case. It started with a small petition on change.org. A woman from California created it in 2020, saying she couldn't sleep after watching the interrogation footage. She wrote, "There's something we're not being told. Too many details don't add up." Within weeks, tens of thousands had signed. By the following year, the number had doubled. The comments beneath the petition revealed something powerful: a collective yearning for clarity. "I can't stop thinking about Shanann and those little girls. I just want justice to feel complete. Please, look again." That's the strange paradox of true crime: closure is supposed to end pain, but sometimes it deepens it. The official narrative gives the facts, but the heart keeps asking questions. As these petitions spread, so did their influence. YouTubers made videos titled, "Why Chris Watts' Case Needs to be Reopened." Reddit threads connected alleged inconsistencies in the autopsy reports and timeline. Even journalists revisited the story, not because there was new evidence, but because the public had made it impossible to ignore. From the outside, it looked like obsession. But at its core, it was something more human: grief disguised as suspicion. People couldn't accept the randomness of the horror, so they searched for a reason that might make it make sense. One of the most viral videos to come from the petition movement was uploaded by a mother of two from Texas. She looked into the camera, tears in her eyes, and said, "When I see Shanann's videos, I see myself. When I see those babies, I see mine. I just can't accept that this is all there is." That video alone inspired over 40,000 new signatures. But what does reopening a case like this actually mean? Legally, it's nearly impossible. Once a person has pleaded guilty and the case is sealed, it can only be reopened if new, concrete evidence emerges: DNA, confessions from others, or official misconduct. In the Watts case, none of that exists. There are no new witnesses. No new findings. No proof of third-party involvement. Law enforcement in Weld County has repeatedly confirmed that the investigation remains closed and complete. Every major agency involved, local police, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI, stated there is no basis to reopen it. Yet, the petitions keep coming. Because to many, the system's finality feels cold. People don't just want justice, they want narrative justice, a story that feels complete. And when emotion meets bureaucracy, belief takes over. Across Facebook and TikTok, influencers began reading from those petitions as if they were case files. Some claimed to have inside sources. Others used emotional language, "The truth will set Shanann free." It sounded noble, even righteous. But it also blurred the line between advocacy and entertainment. In truth, these movements say more about our culture than the crime itself. We live in an era where public opinion can resurrect a closed case, not in court, but in consciousness. A digital echo chamber where every share, comment, and hashtag feels like action. But behind those screens are real people, the Rzosek family, who've spent years trying to rebuild their lives. For them, each petition isn't hope. It's reopening a wound. Shanann's mother once said in an interview, "We live with this every day. Every article, every rumor, it brings it all back. We don't need it reopened. We need peace." Her words highlight a painful truth. Sometimes, reopening a case in public opinion means closing the door on healing. Still, others argue that this very public persistence serves a purpose. It keeps domestic violence in the conversation. It keeps victim stories visible. It reminds people that monsters often look like neighbors. And maybe, that's the real reason so many fight for this case to stay alive. Not because they expect new evidence, but because they refuse to let indifference win. There's power in remembrance, even when the facts are settled. There's something deeply human in wanting to bear witness, to keep the memory of injustice burning like a candle in a dark room. But every movement born of grief walks a fragile line between justice and obsession. Some followers light candles in Shanann's memory. Others send angry messages to strangers they believe no more. One honors the dead. The other haunts the living. By 2025, the petitions have become a symbol, not of reopening the legal case, but of reopening the conversation. Every few months, a new version emerges, often using different wording, sometimes citing unverified, new evidence. Most are quickly dismissed by law enforcement. But each one draws media attention, pushing the case back into headlines, reigniting debates, reawakening pain. And maybe that's the truest form of immortality in the digital age, not statues or memorials, but endless debate. The what story may never be reopened in court, but it will never truly close in public memory. Because when people say, reopen the case, what they really mean is, make it make sense. And sense, that's the one thing this story will never give. In every true crime story, there's a moment when the world moves on, when the headlines fade, the cameras leave, and the hashtags slow. But for the victims' families, the story never ends. It becomes their shadow, following them through every sunrise, every ordinary moment that should have been shared with the ones they lost. For Shanann's family, the Rzoseks, the pain didn't just stay, it evolved. In the beginning, they spoke publicly, holding on to each other in court, their faces etched with disbelief. Sandra and Frank Rzosek sat through every hearing, every testimony, every graphic detail. When the sentencing was handed down, Shanann's mother told the court, "You took away my baby girl, my grandchildren, and my son-in-law. We loved you like our own." Her words were not screamed. They were whispered through tears, the kind that come from a grief too deep for sound. After that day, they retreated from the cameras. The family who once smiled in holiday videos, who celebrated Shanann's birthdays with laughter and candles, began living behind closed doors. They still post tributes occasionally, photos of Shanann and the girls, captioned with short messages of love and remembrance. But for the most part, they remain quiet. That silence became its own message. While the internet debated motives and theories, the Rzoseks chose peace. Because when a crime has already taken everything from you, protecting your quiet becomes a form of survival. In interviews, Shanann's father, Frank, said something that stays with people even now. "I wake up every morning and it's the same nightmare. But I still talk to her. I talk to my daughter every day." He still calls her his little girl. He says the sound of her voice in old videos is both comfort and pain, a reminder that love doesn't die, it just changes shape. For the victims' families, closure is a myth. There is no ending, no neat resolution. Every birthday that passes, every holiday that arrives, marks another reminder of what should have been. And yet, through the darkness, the Rzuseks have found purpose. They've become quiet advocates for awareness, speaking not for fame, but to prevent another family from living the same nightmare. Shanann's mother has spoken in church gatherings about recognizing red flags in relationships, about trusting intuition, about not normalizing emotional withdrawal or manipulation. Her message is simple: if you feel something is wrong, don't silence it. The tragedy that destroyed their lives has, in a painful way, become a lesson for others. It's a legacy Shanann would likely have wanted, to turn pain into protection. Still, their silence in the face of public obsession speaks volumes. They have watched strangers debate their daughter's death for years. They have seen her videos turned into thumbnails, her laughter dissected frame by frame. And yet, they rarely respond. In 2024, after a new wave of YouTube theories resurfaced, Shanann's brother, Frankie Jr., posted a brief message on social media. "Please, stop spreading lies. My sister was a real person. My nieces were real little girls. They deserve peace." It wasn't anger, it was exhaustion. The kind that comes when mourning turns into defense. Their silence isn't indifference. It's resistance. A refusal to let grief become content. Because when you lose everything, control over your own narrative is the only thing left to protect. Behind that silence, though, there's an echo, the echo of three names that the world can't forget. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. Names that appear in hashtags, candles, tattoos, and memorial videos. Names that continue to breathe through those who love them, even when words run out. Every year on August 13th, a small group gathers outside the Watts' former home. They leave flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes. The neighborhood is quiet now, the house resold, repainted, stripped of the memories that once defined it. But for those who stand on that driveway, it's sacred ground, not for what happened there, but for what was lost there. Some stand in prayer, others in silence. And when they leave, they take something intangible with them. A renewed sense of how fragile life can be, and how important it is to truly see the people we love before it's too late. That's the haunting beauty and cruelty of stories like this. They remind us that evil can hide in plain sight, but love, even after death, leaves traces that never disappear. The Rzusek family lives quietly now, away from headlines, surrounded by faith and therapy and time, the only medicine grief ever respects. They don't seek revenge. They don't seek attention. They seek peace. And maybe that's the lesson in their silence. Justice ends in courtrooms. But healing begins in the spaces where no one is watching. For most people, true crime is something they watch, discuss, and then move on from. But the Chris Watts case didn't fade. It stayed. It lingered, like a wound that never fully closes. And to understand why, we have to look beyond the crime itself and into something far more uncomfortable, us. Because the truth is, this story was never just about what happened inside that house in Colorado. It became a mirror, reflecting everything people fear about love, trust, and the secrets hiding behind ordinary smiles. Chris and Shanann looked like the American dream. Two kids, a growing family, matching t-shirts, cheerful Facebook posts. They lived in a modern house on a quiet street. Their lives looked perfect, and that illusion was familiar. It made people see themselves. And that's exactly what made it unbearable when it shattered. The case struck a nerve because it destroyed the illusion that danger has a face. It reminded people that evil doesn't always come with warning signs, sometimes it wears a wedding ring and tucks children into bed. That's why people couldn't stop watching the footage, reading the documents, and analyzing the tone of every word he spoke. They weren't just studying Chris Watts. They were studying their own fear. We need stories like this to remind us that we're safe, that we're not like him, that our lives aren't built on hidden cracks. But the longer we watch, the less certain we become. Because every couple has arguments. Every family has secrets. Every smile hides something private. And that's what makes this case more haunting than others, its ordinariness. Psychologists who study public obsession with true crime say it's not fascination with death, it's fascination with control. When something horrifying happens to someone who seemed safe, our brains start searching for explanations. We think, if I can understand why, maybe it could never happen to me. So we dissect, analyze, and theorize, not because we're morbid, but because we're scared. But fear can be addictive. And on the internet, fear is currency. The more people talked about the case, the more platforms rewarded that conversation, likes, clicks, views. And soon, something strange happened, the tragedy became entertainment. The deeper message. About domestic violence, emotional isolation, and manipulation, got buried under endless speculation about side characters, theories, and conspiracies. We stopped asking why it happened and started asking what we missed. We stopped talking about the victims and started talking about the man who destroyed them. That's the uncomfortable truth about why this story still circulates. Because it feeds both pain and curiosity. It fulfills two opposite needs, to mourn and to analyze, to cry and to watch. But behind the obsession lies something simpler, empathy that doesn't know where to go. When people read Shanann's old posts, her cheerful, good morning videos, her love letters to her husband, they feel something personal. They see a woman who tried to hold her marriage together, who believed love could fix what was already broken. They see themselves. And that recognition hurts. So instead of sitting with that pain, people turn it into investigation. They look for new angles, for hidden motives, for what really happened. Because searching is easier than accepting that sometimes, there is no why. It's easier to believe in missing clues than to face the truth that a man can wake up one morning and destroy everything he once claimed to love. The Chris Watts case became the perfect storm, the digital age met human vulnerability. The footage was public. The faces were familiar. The timeline was traceable. Every text, every photo, every video was archived. And in that archive, people built their own version of the story. But in the process, something sacred got lost. The story stopped belonging to the victims. It became collective property, analyzed, edited, remixed, and reposted millions of times. It turned into what some call the tragedy loop, a cycle where pain becomes performance, and remembrance becomes routine. Even today, when you type Chris Watts into a search bar, you'll find thousands of results, new thumbnails, new updates, new interpretations. Each one promising closure, but delivering the same ache, a reminder that closure doesn't exist for stories like this. So why can't we let go? Maybe because deep down, this story forces us to confront how fragile we all are. Because if the perfect family can collapse overnight, what else can? Because it reveals something people rarely admit, that the line between stability and chaos is thinner than we think. Every true crime story has a lesson hidden beneath the horror. For this one, the lesson might be this. Evil doesn't always hide in strangers. Sometimes, it sleeps beside you. And that realization, quiet, invisible, terrifying, is what keeps people coming back. But there's another reason too. In the end, this isn't just a story about death. It's a story about humanity's desperate search for meaning. About the way grief becomes analysis, and curiosity becomes comfort. And maybe, the reason we keep watching is because we're hoping that, through all the noise, someone will finally say something that makes it all make sense. But there is no sense. Only loss. Only lessons. Only the faint echo of a family's laughter, preserved forever in digital clips, frozen in time. And as long as those videos exist, as long as Shanann's voice can still be heard, this story will live on, not because we can't move on, but because part of us refuses to forget. 7 years have passed. The world has changed. The headlines that once screamed his name have long since faded, replaced by new tragedies, new mysteries, new obsessions. But some stories refuse to stay buried. The What's case is one of them. Not because there's anything left to uncover, the investigation is closed, the confessions are on record, the sentence is final. But because the emotional aftermath never truly ended. It still lives, in every online discussion, every anniversary tribute, every whispered question that begins with, "How could he?" And maybe that's the most haunting part. Even when justice is served, the human heart still hungers for understanding. But understanding and closure are not the same. Justice answers who, but not why. And in that silence between those two questions, the story continues to echo. Today, Chris Watts remains in prison, a number in a system, a man stripped of everything but memory. He will never walk free, never feel sunlight without supervision, never hear his children's voices again. His life, like his story, is suspended in repetition, cell, prayer, letters, silence. But while his world is frozen, the world outside keeps replaying his actions. And that's the cruel paradox of modern crime. The punishment is isolation, yet the story lives forever. Even as he fades behind walls, his image multiplies on screens. Even as he disappears from society, his name trends again and again. Because in the age of endless information, some crimes never die, they're archived, replayed, and reinterpreted until they become something larger than the people who lived them. But behind all the noise, the theories, the debates, the thumbnails, there's still a family that lost everything. There's a mother who wakes up every day with the memory of her daughter's laugh. There's a father who still sets aside a chair that will never be filled again. And there are 2 little girls, remembered in the songs they once sang, in the smiles that flicker across every photo, in the love that even death couldn't erase. This is where the obsession must end, and remembrance must begin. Because beyond the speculation lies the truth that matters most. This wasn't a mystery story. It was a tragedy. And tragedies aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be felt, learned from, and never repeated. Shanann Watts believed in love, family, and second chances. She believed in sharing joy online because she thought her happiness could inspire someone else. And maybe that's what makes this story so painful. She was trying to spread light in a world that can be unbearably dark. Her legacy shouldn't be the way she died, but the way she lived. Determined. Loving. Hopeful. She fought to hold her family together until the very end. For the viewers, the listeners, and the millions who still find themselves drawn to this story, maybe it's time to shift our gaze. Not to him. But to her. To Bella. To Celeste. To every victim of domestic violence whose story didn't make the news. Because every click, every share, every retelling carries power, the power to exploit pain, or the power to honor it. And the choice between those two defines what kind of world we build. The Chris Watts case will never be reopened in the courts. But it remains wide open in conscience. A scar that reminds us what happens when silence replaces communication, when pride replaces empathy, when control replaces love. And maybe that's why, even now, people keep returning to this story, not for gossip, not for theories, but for the lesson that hides beneath the horror. That evil is not always a shadow in the corner. Sometimes, it's the quiet man standing beside you, smiling for the camera. In the end, the petitions will fade. The debates will end. The headlines will vanish. But the message will remain. Listen when something feels wrong. Speak when silence could cost a life. And remember that behind every true crime headline, there are people, real, breathing souls, who once believed love was enough. For Shanann, for Bella, for Celeste, and for every victim who never got to tell their story. We remember. We learn. We carry them forward. Because the case is closed. But the lesson is not forgotten.